Their head coach had no NBA playing experience and started off as a player assistant coach in the Bundesliga 2nd division. He had to start out as the Heat's video coordinator almost 30 years ago. They only have 4 former first-round picks in their top 8 in their rotation, and only 2 of them were lottery picks. The other half of the rotation are guys that not a single team in the league thought was worth drafting at all. This year's Miami Heat is the ultimate underdog story and also the NBA's biggest mystery. From the play-in to the finals as an 8 seed, only the 2nd team in league history to do so, and half the key players being undrafted nobodies, you might be wondering, who are they? How did the Heat manage to put together a group with an average draft position of 40th and turn them into a championship level team? Well, let's start with the big one, Jimmy Butler. He had a crazy path that even allowed him to get to the Heat in the first place. He was the last pick in the first round in 2011 to the Bulls, where he eventually developed into an all-star caliber player. But in 2017, the team wanted to go into a bit of a rebuild, so they sent him to Minnesota for Lauri Markkanen, Chris Dunn, and Zach LaVine, which now looks like a pretty incredible trade, by the way, considering how the Butler-Minnesota era went and how much Markkanen has improved. In Minnesota, things don't last very long for Butler at all. He leads them to the playoffs in 2018, but just 10 games into the following season, he organizes a practice blow-up media firestorm that all but forces the team to trade him away, this time to the Sixers, which is where things get really weird. This, in my opinion, was the best version of any process-era Sixers team with Jimmy Butler, Joel Embiid, and a, at the time, still very good Ben Simmons. Butler was awesome for Philly, and they only didn't advance further in the postseason because of the insane Kawhi Leonard shot in Game 7 of the 2019 playoffs as the Raptors went on to win the title that year. Without this shot, the Sixers very easily could have won the 2019 title and kept Butler. However, things weren't great between him and the team that offseason, as at this point he clearly developed a bit of a temperamental reputation, specifically towards then head coach Brett Brown. Ultimately, as he loves to point out, the Sixers chose re-signing Tobias Harris and empowering Ben Simmons over keeping Butler, and he finally ends up on the Heat that offseason. But that isn't the full story. Butler wanted to go to Miami because of his hard feelings with the Sixers, even though they didn't have the cap space to sign him outright. So rather than lose Butler for nothing to another team in free agency, the Sixers went ahead and sent him to the Heat in exchange for Josh Richardson, who played just 55 mediocre games for the Sixers. So after all that, his 4th team in 3 seasons, Jimmy Butler found his home in Miami. Next up, we have the true mystery men of the Miami Heat. All of these undrafted players that are playing huge minutes for them, beginning with Max Strus. He went undrafted in 2019 as a 23-year-old prospect that put up huge scoring numbers in college at DePaul and had quite the NBA journey before getting to Miami. He signed with the Celtics after the draft, was waived, then picked up by the Bulls, and then waived again. But it wasn't that simple. In December of his rookie year, while playing for the Bulls G League team, he tore his ACL, sidelining him for over 8 months. At that point, he'd played in 2 NBA games, scored 5 total points, and suffered a catastrophic injury before making any noise in the league at all. Then 10 months after tearing his ACL, he earned a training camp invite with the Heat, where he managed to stick around. He didn't do much initially, but in his 2nd season in Miami became a 40% three-point shooter and a valuable rotation player, and his role only continued to increase until he somehow became a starter on a finals team. Next on the undrafted list is Gabe Vincent. He went undrafted in 2018 as a 23-year-old prospect from a small school. Do you see a trend here? And he signed with the Kings in 2018 and was waived a day later, but he did get some decent run in the G League, putting up some really good numbers. He didn't get another NBA look until January of 2020 with the Heat, as they picked him up directly from the G League on a 2-way contract after being named the G League's most improved player that year. A year and a half after going undrafted, he finally played in his first NBA game, a whopping 1 minute of playing time on January 27th against the Magic. A little over 3 years later, Vincent put up 29 points against the Celtics to give the Heat a 3-0 series lead, and just like Strus, he didn't do much initially, but slowly grew into a solid rotation player and again, a starter on a finals team. Next up is Duncan Robinson. He also went undrafted in 2018, but I need to cover his college story first. Out of high school, he attended Williams College, a Division III program. So in 2015, he was at a D3 school, and then 6 years later, he signs a $95 million NBA contract. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After 1 season at Williams College, he transferred to Michigan, was a solid college player, and actually didn't have to bounce around upon going undrafted in the NBA. is a really strong summer league performance where he shot over 60% from 3 across 5 games, which ultimately led him to being picked up by the Heat. At the time of his NBA debut, he was the first former Division III player to start his career in the NBA since 2000. He got some G League run as a rookie, but in his second season was one of the best three-point shooters in the league and a key piece of the Heat's run to the finals in the bubble in 2020. His play did dip pretty much immediately after signing the contract, but he's come back to form recently and is a big reason why the Heat found themselves in the finals in the first place. And lastly, in the undrafted section is Caleb Martin. He was not selected in the 2019 draft, but made a bit of noise with the Charlotte Hornets for a few seasons before being waived and then picked up by the Heat in September of 2021. He then continued to improve his game to the point where he kind of carried the Heat through that conference final series against Boston. And I actually just made a full-length video on Caleb Martin. It's 8.5 minutes, talks about his entire career, his whole journey getting to the Heat. So this would be a great time to watch that video after this one's done. Okay, but hold on for 1 second. We need to address how exactly the Heat have managed to make all 4 of these undrafted guys viable NBA starters. So we need to talk about the coach, who's just as much of an underdog as anybody else on this roster. Erik Spoelstra never played in the NBA and only had 1 scholarship offer from the University of Portland to play college basketball. Then, as I mentioned in the intro, he was in the Bundesliga second division as a player assistant coach for 2 seasons before the Heat hired him as their video coordinator. He quickly established himself as an incredibly hard worker, moving his way up through the coaching staff for over a decade before being named the head coach of the Heat in 2008. And then just a few years later, he was right in the middle of the most pressure-packed environment in NBA history. LeBron and Chris Bosh joined D-Wade in Miami, and all of a sudden Erik Spoelstra, as an inexperienced coach, was just standing around wondering what exactly is going to happen here. And things got weird pretty immediately. People expected the Heat to break the single game wins record. They were that kind of good, but they started that first season just 9-8, and LeBron especially was not a fan of Spoelstra. He was publicly and physically defiant towards him and wanted him gone. But the Heat didn't budge and are one of the few teams in the league that actually would have stood by their guy in that situation, and they turned that season around, made the finals, won 2 titles in 4 years before LeBron returned to Cleveland, and ever since then, Spoelstra has been one of the best coaches in the entire league. Constantly willing to make adjustments and obviously outstanding when it comes to developing talent. But they have gotten good value on some of the higher drafted players on their roster as well. Tyler Hero was picked 13th in the 2019 draft after guys like Jarrett Culver, Kobe White, and Cam Reddish, and immediately made an impact on the Heat as he was a huge reason that they made the finals in the bubble in 2020 in his rookie season. Although he didn't do much this postseason due to a broken hand suffered in the first round, he's a huge part of the team regardless. Next up is Bam Adebayo, who was picked 14th in the 2017 draft behind guys like Josh Jackson, Frank Ntilikina, and Zach Collins. After struggling as a scorer in his first 2 seasons, he broke out in his 3rd year and is one of the best two-way bigs in the league. They also added Kyle Lowry, who after a great career in Toronto was ready for a fresh start, and the Raptors decided to sign and trade him to the Heat in 2021 for Precious Achiuwa and Goran Dragic. And those are really the main guys for this team. They also got Kevin Love and Cody Zeller as buyout players in February 2023. Haywood Highsmith was undrafted in 2019 and signed in 2021. Victor Oladipo was traded for basically nothing in March of 2021, but the core of this team is those first 8 guys, 4 undrafted, 1 on 4 teams in 3 years after being picked with the last selection in the first round, 2 late lottery picks, and a former late first round pick who they added in his 30s, all led by a guy that almost nobody in the organization knew about over 25 years ago, arguably the most improbable roster and team in league history to make the finals.